welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin, and we're back after a brief absence. I'm back home. Last episode, I was, in transit back from Russia, but I'm fully settled in now, so we're here to bring you the news about World War III. A lot of events have happened, so much so to where we really needed to go back and rack our brains because we had missed some things that had happened, and so much more has happened since then. So we're here to talk about possible impending invasion of Lebanon. March 15th has been laid down as a deadline by the Zionists, of course. Big things happening in Ukraine with the Ukrainians preparing for what they perceive as a potential Russian Kharkov offensive. Of course, we see Sweden entering NATO. We see crazy things going on in the Caucasus on the Russian side and south with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and of course we've got some church updates like we always do and some stuff going on in Greece that has to do with some prophecies. So stay tuned for that. But with all of that, Dmitry, how are you doing? It's good to be back.
It's great to have you back, and we have a lot of news to speak about from all around the world, just kind of building on the narratives we've already seen started this year in 2024 as we enter almost into the middle of March already, so almost a quarter through the year and heading towards Great Lent. But as we see in the Holy Land, the conflict continues, and it seems like the escalation is not really meeting a peaceful end, despite the calls of the ICJ and the so-called international community in various Islamic countries, and even the majority of the BRICS nations actually calling for an Israeli-Palestinian peace. No one's really listening on the ground. In fact, the Palestinians are even calling for Israel to back off. But at this point, they're dependent more, I think, on their allies and neighbors in the north, Hezbollah and the Lebanese people, actually to maybe stop Israel by force, right? This is the narrative we've seen kind of build. And at this point, Tel Aviv, I think, has noticed that the Hezbollah northern Lebanese threat is actually a real one. And so the Israeli defense minister, as well as Special Envoy Amos Hochstein, have actually stated that if by March 15th there isn't an agreement with Lebanon to stop the bombardment of the northern territories, including northern territories of Israel, including the city which we'll discuss of Kiryat Shmona, then Israel will increase strikes on Lebanon, perhaps even force a ground invasion. So we're talking about an escalation which we haven't really seen yet, but of course which we feared would take place if Israel wouldn't calm itself down over the coming months. And now I think we've actually reached that point, and it's Israel who's actually setting the deadlines, because I think Israel understands the threats of continuous bombardment of its cities. It's also demoralizing the Israeli conscript, the Israeli army soldiers actually stationed in the north who just, we've seen the photos, the tanks are all standing there, they're all in waiting. The Israeli army is getting restless. So Israel itself needs to really make that move. And it looks like they're kind of thinking ahead and looking to maybe even force a second front in this war.
No, and there's been protests in Lebanon from all sorts of right-wing, Christian, non-Christian, Muslim, secular groups that have become so fed up with the situation in Gaza and the situation in the West Bank and the situation across the Holy Land that they're, calling for action. They're calling for the Lebanese government to be stronger against Israel as opposed to being this sort of moderating force towards Hezbollah, saying that we don't want to get dragged into your war, all that kind of stuff. So all these developments are very interesting. We'll talk about some of the details, but before we dive right in, I just wanted to do a quick housekeeping issue at the beginning of the show. Wanted to thank one of our fans. Not even one of our fans. Somebody made a clip of our recent episode of Ether Hour of us discussing the situation on Mount Athos during World War II. I want to tell everybody, if you're a World War Now fan, those kind of clips, those things really help us out a lot. So if you listen to the show regularly, think about maybe turning your favorite segment into a 2-minute clip with some subtitles and some images or anything like that. That would really help us out. So if you could do that, obviously that's a good way to show support. So again, thank you so much to people that have done that in the past. But back into the news. You mentioned the March 15th deadline. Of course, it seems that Hezbollah has shown their capabilities just from their positions with their missiles, like we talked about Kiryat Shmona, to the point where, and obviously Gaza has been, leveled so much at this point to where Netanyahu both trying to remain in power and trying to use this momentum that they have, where, the U.S. is still allowing them to go full out, basically take that momentum into Lebanon to their other immediate enemies before this kind of state of exception goes away, because that's kind of what this is. Of course, they're in this unity military government, all of the prosecution of Netanyahu for his judicial reform has kind of faded into the background. And now as the U.S. election heats up, of course, we see the general population against Biden for his tacit support for Israel, but then we see Donald Trump, ramping up his pro-Israel rhetoric. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, but it does seem that while Israel wants to use this to their advantage, it could ultimately backfire for them because we know Iran supports Hezbollah and all of the axis of resistance. But it does seem that, I mean, the Houthis, who up until this point have been the only ones actually basically using their full capability to support the Palestinians, there's only so much they can do, and even in the State of the Union, Biden pledged to do even more extensive strikes and take more extensive action to protect all the ships in the Red Sea and to prevent the Houthis from doing what they're doing. Obviously, they sunk the Ruby Mar, which was a British-owned, Belize-flagged cargo ship that is now, I guess, spilling oil into the sea. It's like actually sunk. It's one of the, I think, one or two now actual ships that they've managed to sink directly into the sea with their missile attacks. And Ansar Allah, if they're eventually going to, I don't know about run out of missiles, but they're eventually going to, be thwarted by, I guess, a elaborate web of protection from, the US, Germany, the UK, all of these countries that are participating in Operation Prosperity Guardian, to the point where, any kind of effect they were having perhaps on the conflict is going to be minimized. It seems that for the sake of the Palestinians, they're going to have to get some relief from the north. And obviously, it seems that both sides kind of want this to happen in a different way for different reasons. So we'll see how it actually goes and what map changes occur on the ground, because that would be an extremely dramatic escalation. To the point where it would start to outweigh the Ukraine conflict, because up till now, the Ukraine conflict doesn't have any other parties involved. Of course, we see some things going on with Lukashenko and Moldova that we're going to talk about in a second. But if this really does spread to Lebanon and it really does, bring in the rest of the axis of resistance in that way, this will truly be a generation-defining conflict, although in many ways it already is.
Yeah, that's right. And it kind of explains, I guess, in layman's terms, exactly why Israel is setting these deadlines, why Israel thinks it has authority to act now. It's because, well, Israel is arguing for now from a position of strength. Egypt is sort of under its heel. Egypt is building refugee camps in the Sinai Peninsula for Israel, essentially for Israeli US dollars. And U.S. taxpayer dollars at that. Israel is in a position of strength to actually dictate to its neighbors and also to the Palestinians who maybe even disagree, those Palestinians still working with the Israelis, especially those participating in the Knesset, of course protesting, but also very lukewarm on their exact position on the genocide that's currently taking place. So Israel does feel like it's on a timer. And the other big timer is that this weekend, the Islamic, I guess they're the equivalent of the Islamic Great Lent begins, which is Ramadan on the 9th of March. So it's going to get really interesting when they start visiting the Mosque of the Mar in the old city of Jerusalem, as well as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And I mean, for the Muslims, I guess it's just as equivalent as for us it is to visit church during Great Lent, as well as all the feast day periods following Great Lent, Pentecost, and Easter. So for them, it would be completely normal visiting these holy places. But we've already heard the mayor of Jerusalem, all of these authorities, including even people like Netanyahu and those around him, actually stating very clearly that there will be crackdowns on exactly who's allowed into the old city. So I think that's something we just need to consider. On the diplomatic end, so moving into as possibly why the US has begun finally sending down aid, right? As we've seen, this is probably the most active clips. And they've kind of come in the wake of the fact that we've received live footage, we are receiving probably as we speak, really disturbing footage from Gaza, from the refugee camps, and from, I think this footage is from central and northern Gaza, actually, from places which the Israeli army has already kind of driven over, and those places really where humanitarian aid isn't reaching, because we're seeing children starving to death. And the footage really, it's reminiscent of the Holodomor and some of the other famines artificially caused by the Talmudic Bolsheviks during the 1920s and 30s against the Russian Orthodox Christian Slavic populations of Eastern Europe. Like, these are really reminiscent. I mean, it's the same signature as for those people who acted in those areas a century ago. Now they're acting here in Gaza against the Palestinians. It's very, very similar sort of signature of action, and it's very demoralizing for the locals. So this is probably why, again, yes, sure, Benny Gantz has spoken to Kamala Harris. He's visited her at the end of February. They spoke, I think, for about 3 days. Benny Gantz, for all those interested, you've probably heard his name. We mentioned it before. He's the Israeli politician most opposed to Netanyahu, I would say actively, but he also has an army background. He's an army general in the IDF, or like a retired
Hmm.
general. So Benny Gantz speaking to Kamala Harris, organizing these aid drops with the Biden administration for the Palestinians in the wake of all this crazy footage of starving children, like something out of the like World War II propaganda movies of Auschwitz coming out. It's absolutely heartbreaking, especially with Ramadan coming up as well. The Muslim world is going to start reacting, especially when it's time to have a pilgrimage to the holy places of the Islamic faith. I mean, they cannot ignore what's happening, and I think this is why Israel is really kind of waking up and saying, okay, look, we're going to have to work with the Biden administration somehow to make the situation to come to terms with what's happening, perhaps maybe. But how do you move all these millions of people again in the south of Gaza? Which, by the way, this is, I guess, the good news of the week, is that the ground invasion of South Gaza has not yet begun. Rafah has not been completely demolished by the Israeli army. Sure, there's bombardment going on, which continuously every day at least 10 plus Palestinians are dying, being killed every single day continuously by the bombardment of the IDF. But Israel hasn't yet sent its tanks into the refugee camps, which would be completely incredible. And from like a bad perspective, just horrible thing that would take place. So it's just really curious to see exactly how the Biden administration, moving up towards the US election, now that we're in Ramadan season, basically, how will they respond to Israeli atrocities moving forward, especially when the international community is already tired of this conflict. And even the Islamic states, which are kind of quite lukewarm, are actually going to start reacting very soon.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate assessment. Of course, we saw the Hezbollah 50 rocket launch into Kiryat Shmona, which one of the most Jewish cities in the Holy Land, very much not, not as Christian and Muslim as some of these other places that are in the West Bank, obviously, where the settlements are driving mostly Muslims, of course, out of their homes. We all see the videos of, Jews, even from places like Brooklyn, stealing, just objectively stealing Palestinians' houses and whatnot. But you mentioned the airdrops and, Benny Gantz going and coordinating those sorts of things. We now see the Biden administration pledging to create some kind of port, this kind of floating port thing off the coast of Gaza to facilitate humanitarian aid. Of course, that would mean all sorts of U.S. troops and military contractors would be effectively in Gaza, so that's a very interesting development, of course, providing maybe the easiest false flag situation for Israel to, abuse that maybe I could think of. But it also, of course, is curious. We see all this discussion of the oil and natural gas fields off the coast of Gaza, off the coast of southern Lebanon, some of these places that if Israel just takes a small amount of territory, they gain full sea access, kind of similar to the Guyana Essequibo situation in South America. Just some of these areas in the Gaza Strip and other parts of what they perceive as greater Israel would give them extreme energy access, especially as Egypt and Cyprus and Turkey all have recently discovered huge oil and LNG fields around the Eastern Mediterranean. I think Israel wants to exploit this as perhaps even their relationship with Azerbaijan for so much energy, that may come under jeopardy because Iran, of course, has kind of a trump card geographically on Azerbaijan, as does Syria and these other countries that separate the country from Israel. So we have this idea that perhaps this port would be something, because it is supposedly proposed to be in a position right off one of these oil fields. Perhaps it would be abused and ultimately used to magically transform into an Israeli, energy harvesting operation. So that's always an interesting aspect of this, because Israel itself, within Israel proper, doesn't really have many natural resources at all. It's entirely a religious project as far as the geography is concerned there. So they have a lot of energy needs. Of course, they are one of the only first world, quote unquote, really industrialized cosmopolitan countries that, has the kind of demand that a Western European state might need. So it's always thinking about all of these civilizational aspects when it expands its borders, when it, makes enemies, and when it goes into these places. So I think we're going to be watching that very closely, because Netanyahu has talked about at least a 10-year Gaza occupation at this point, that being kind of the minimum. Of course, for a while they were talking about a full-on government. They were talking about incorporating into Israel. We had some pushback about how it should be this maybe Saudi or other Muslim state-run kind of unity government with the UN, but I don't think the Israelis like that. So now we've got 10-year occupation. So it's a very tough development. And like you said, Dimitri, we're seeing some of the worst, human rights tragedies that we've seen in a long time coming out of all regions of Gaza, because there are people that didn't leave the north. There are people that stayed, and you can think of that what you like, but I don't think it excuses the Jewish behavior recently. So I'll leave that at that. Unless you have anything else to say on the Holy Land, Dimitri, I'm ready to move to Ukraine or, New Heavenly Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think just briefly, like the entire scenario is incredibly dystopian. The energy fields you spoke about, the gas and oil fields, are actually named, and I'm not even sure who named them, but they're called the Leviathan fields in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, it's just quite apocalyptic imagery, very, devil related. So, of course, these are the main energy sources for future Greater Israel, which probably the Antichrist will rule in the future, right? If their plans go ahead. And, even the US airdrops, like it has to come naturally. It's so rushed now that the Palestinians people, and especially the children, are starving, that the rushed airdrops at the last minute, they've had all these months to actually, begin providing humanitarian aid. But no, now it's rushed. They're rushing their meals. They're dropping everything with these giant crates and boxes. And of course, the parachutes are malfunctioning. So even today, just an hour ago, one of these aid boxes, the parachutes malfunctioned, and the boxes fell and they squashed 5 people. Just like that joke where America smells, or the U.S. Deep state smells oil in the Middle East. They'll come and bring democracy to your country. And here it's like America's going to bring food in its own way to feed these people. And we've spoken, it's really dystopian, quite demonic, and we've spoken about the fear of famine, the potential of things like the grain deal going wrong, the future wars if World War III does break out in the near future. Countries like Ethiopia, places in the Middle East like Egypt, very populated places, and even Palestine itself at the moment will experience really severe food shortages. So we're seeing that now live. This is kind of like this weird apocalyptic entree that we're having. Like this is an example of what the greater war will bring, unfortunately, and we need to prepare for that. I mean, it's all kind of scriptural. It's not really outside of the realm of possibility, I think. But yes, definitely very dystopian reality we're living in, and the Middle East is experiencing that first and foremost. Even I would say, last on the Middle East question, Conrad, last thing, of course, the burning of Aaron Bushnell as well, as a sign of protest. People are becoming so desperate. Even Antifa liberals such as Aaron, they're not sure how to control themselves. They're not sure how to mentally react, and they don't have the spiritual grounding, and so they burn themselves out in public. He's a US serviceman. You mentioned how they would need to, of course, eventually build that aid port. And even just them traveling to the Middle East, witnessing the genocide taking place mere kilometers away, will cause such a mental drain on them that these people who don't go to church, most of them, they're not well catechized, they just don't have that mental fortitude. They're not mentally, sometimes not even physically, but definitely not spiritually healthy enough to actually undertake the arduous sort of work that the US is putting them through. And frankly, it's unjustified what they're having to do over there. So again, very unfortunate that burning took place, and suicide is never encouraged, but we do need to understand the underlying factors which cause these desperate people to commit such, sort of personal atrocities.
Yeah, I'll give my brief take on the Aaron Bushnell thing. I realize we didn't get the chance to talk about it the past 2 weeks, but of course it's terrible. Of course you can't commit suicide. Of course, regrettably, he is unlikely to, perhaps, I guess to put it nicely, make it through the toll houses because of the suicidal nature of his death. But at the same time, all these people dunking on him, saying like, oh, he died for nothing. I mean, look, what we're talking about him on the show now, obviously he may not be quite as iconic as, the Buddhist monk or whatever that self-immolated because of the Vietnam War, but I don't think it'll be that less relevant. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's the videos and the pictures are going to last forever. Every time it comes around, it'll be something that people can talk about. So this idea that he did literally nothing, he did one of the most dramatic things you could do. And as far as, I guess, kind of a moral comparison, however, this might sound dramatic. I'm not actually encouraging anybody to do this or not, but if you want to do something that dramatic, frankly, he might have been better off, at least for his soul, just somehow getting into Gaza and joining up and fighting against Israel himself, right? Wouldn't that be, like, if you believe in that cause, if you believe it's literally worth dying for in the way that you did, perhaps that might have been, a way to be a bit more, be a bit less morally bankrupt, I guess, in your protest and in your resistance to what you perceive as, Zionist terror. So, of course, pray for his soul. Obviously, everybody that commits suicide should be prayed for. Of course, it's known in the church you don't actually get an Orthodox funeral if you take your own life in that way. So it's really important to not fall for that and not, listen to that devil in your ear, regardless of why you do it. I think it'd be better to take even a myriad of other types of dramatic action than to do something like that. So I guess that's what I'll say about it, but you're definitely not going to catch me denigrating him or saying, some of the terrible things that Zionists and others have said about him, despite the fact that he clearly had problems and, as far as I could tell, was a victim of some fairly insane COVIDianism from his parents while during the pandemic and everything, and I'm sure that could drive anybody insane. So I'll be praying for Aaron Bushnell. I think everybody else should, but with all of that, again, a bit of a tragic segment, but let's move to, well, it is World War III, right? So here we are. But let's go to Ukraine. I wanted to start with what I thought was fascinating. It'll have to do with another segment we talk about later in the show. That's been a theme for the past 5 or 6 weeks. Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Prime Minister of Greece, was in Ukraine like a genius, showing solidarity with his future, perhaps NATO brethren. That may be how he perceives it. And of course, the Russians struck Odessa. I believe it was Odessa that they were in. And of course, he was talking about the historic Greek nature of many of the Black Sea coast of Russia/Ukraine. Of course, we've talked about that before in some of our Ether Hours. We've even talked about how the Greeks, in Crimea, in Odessa, were some of those that were targeted, by the Jews and that were involved in some of these pogrom-esque, activities and whatnot. So it's very interesting history. Be sure to get behind the paywall to listen to some of those episodes. But while they were talking, Russian missiles thundered around, and, I don't know exactly how close they really were. It probably wasn't particularly close at all. But next thing you know, we have the headlines. They tried to assassinate Zelensky. I guess if they tried to assassinate Zelensky, they were trying to assassinate Mitsotakis as well. For what? I mean, being a homo lover? Like, did they see, was Russia like, this guy made the first, Orthodox country legalize gay marriage, let's just blow him up. Like, what? I don't think that was the calculus, but I guess maybe some Ukrainians might think so.
Yeah, that's right. I think it was simply fate that Russia was aiming for a strategic target in the area, and this is like that important city we spoke about, the grain shipments. It is Ukraine's largest port city, and it could even be the largest port city on the Black Sea, in fact. So it's a really important key place, which of course Mitsotakis, when he did visit, he made it clear that, look, this is an ancient Greek city. There is ancient Greek lineage and heritage. I'm sorry, Prime Minister of Greece, listen. You're destroying your country in real time, despite the ancient heritage. Of course, the ancient Greeks, the Argonauts, Hercules himself colonized the entire Black Sea coast. This is where all these legends come from since the time of the Trojan War and even before that. And so we all understand that's the heritage of the particular area, just like in the Mediterranean. But you do need to consider that your country at the moment is facing the risk of potential extinction through self-sabotage, as well as the threat of naturally foreign invasion through the larger Turkey sitting next door. So I think just this unrealistic expectation of trying to find assistance from a warring country led by Khazarian Zelensky, which his own bishops call him that. In fact, no, Mitsotakis still insists upon actually making allies with the worst people of the world, as opposed to instead of maybe, befriending some of the Orthodox countries around him. And so it's just another sign that the Greek government is completely corrupt. It is at least led by a person who is personally corrupt, personally excommunicated from the church, as has been proven many times in the last fortnight, that there is no repentance from this person, no public statements of apology, and not even any attempts to go back on his words. And now Greece will double down on its assistance to Zelensky, as was rhetorically stated by him in Odessa, which is very unfortunate because this alliance will probably not go anywhere in the long term. I think, especially considering the fact that Russia, based on the maps which we'll discuss very soon of Medvedev, Russia really has an eye on Odessa. Odessa is that historical Russian city, which this area Russia liberated from the Ottoman Empire a long time ago, which again, these are historic enemies of the Greeks as well, mind you, Conrad. And the Greeks actually assisted Russia in these battles in the past, in these Russian imperial battles under Catherine the Great, Paul, and Alexander I. But yet, it's like these politicians simply don't understand. And so maybe when Putin gives his half-an-hour lecture to Tucker Carlson, perhaps that's required in almost every interview segment, because these people really don't understand the history that has been binding Orthodox nations together for centuries at this point. It's just really concerning, the ignorance that's at play here. But then again, both of these people spiritually belonging to another religion, not Orthodox Christianity, meeting up in perhaps the most, shall we say, Talmudic and Yiddish city of the Black Sea, is really just a sign of continuity, especially since we've moved on from Israel to this particular subject and moving into a new Khazaria.
Of course, we've seen you talk about the Medvedev map, and we talk about some big Moldova news, of course. In the previous episode, we talked about the Pridnestrovia, rather. They don't like being called Transnistria, so the Pridnestrovians requested aid from Russia. We haven't really seen any direct increases in troops or anything specific coming from that, but there have been, obviously, the Russians have pledged that they will, protect them, whatever that actually means. And right after that, of course, we saw the Gagagian government, which is another autonomous region of Moldova, slightly less independent on the ground, practically speaking, than Pridnestrovia is, but it's full of the Turkic Gagagian people who are nonetheless entirely Orthodox Christian. And their president actually was in Russia, met with Putin, and then, much like I did, flew back to Istanbul and then flew to their country of origin, back to Chisinau, and there was even threats from the Moldovan government that she was going to be arrested, and there was large police presence, but she arrived at the airport with, her loving supporters, and, they were able to leave without being molested by the police. So the situation there is, it seems that the Moldovan government is afraid to actually, do anything too dramatic, much like I think the Russians have been afraid to escalate the situation, because this is, we talked about the Lebanese situation with Israel, how that would be a very dramatic, involving another country directly. If this Moldova situation with all of these breakaway republics actually becomes a front in the war in Ukraine, that would be the most dramatic escalation basically since Nord Stream, at least, if not since the tanks started rolling in February 2022. So this is all a very delicate situation, I guess you could say. And regarding Medvedev's map, I mean, it's kind of an update to that map he released in the first few months of the SMO. He's shrunk Ukraine even more. The rump state continues to get smaller. And, Poland and these other countries continue to get more land. I think we'll talk about how some of the church stuff we're going to talk about may relate to the future map of Ukraine. But Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on the map, because at the same time, the map doesn't seem to show any kind of Belarusian expansion, but we've seen this week Lukashenko has signed an order basically bringing all of the government agencies into wartime operations modes. So I don't know if Belarus, there will be some kind of another attempt on Kiev or something like that from the north, or just some pressure. But these maps seem to be, we may be about to see which map comes out on top.
Well, look, this map certainly paints a much nicer picture than the position Russia is in today, right? This is naturally will move the border further west. Will of course secure Russia's security. Ukraine will turn into this, I guess, not even a buffer state. This is more like a Kosovo-esque sort of scenario where it's not even a real country. Perhaps it won't even have an army, maybe just a police force internally, not even an intelligence force, and it'll just be this tourist-type destination for people who want to go on pilgrimage to Kiev, perhaps, between NATO and Russia. But yes, we do see a large expansion of Poland out into the east, and maybe this is linked to the fact that, Putin did allude to Russian-Polish cooperation. Remember the document he gave Tucker Carlson, the Bogdan Khmelnytsky letter that was sent to Alexei Mikhailovich, and Alexei Mikhailovich famously purchased Ukrainian land from the Polish Rzecz Pospolita, which was the Polish Commonwealth back then. So Russians and Poles have been dealing contractually very sort of business and entrepreneur-like in the past. So perhaps there will be some sort of deal, at least with if Poland wakes up and kind of loosens itself from the NATO EU occupation, which has been under for the last few decades. The interesting expansion of Romania on Medvedev's map is, I think, very curious, given the fact that we'll see this sort of reflected in the church news we mentioned today, because Romania, the Romanian Orthodox Church, is making some major moves, and not just in Moldova, in territories in Bessarabia where it believes it has sort of canonical rights to these particular lands, but also in Ukraine proper, which is very curious. And I think Medvedev, unfortunately, despite his wife having maybe personal connections to Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu, unfortunately, I don't think Medvedev personally understands the implications of what this map sort of presupposes for Russia and for the Russian Ukrainian Orthodox Church, especially considering that both the Lavra in the west, the Pskovo-Pecherskaya Lavra and the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, will be still under foreign occupation. One under NATO, the other one under this weird Ukraine type state. So, but this is of course all in theory. We hope for Russia, at least myself being sort of like a Russian nationalist, we would hope Russia would conquer and sort of liberate, I would say would be the right word, conquer from its enemies this entire landscape, which was once Orthodox Christian, once united, and where Orthodox Christians could worship and venerate its sort of participate in its religious practices without persecution. And I think this still hasn't been taken on board. Medvedev's speech, right, Conrad, to the youth, this persecution wasn't a major point. It's like he's talking about other things. He's talking about trolling. Medvedev's rhetoric is very specific. I think it's still that sort of Soviet-esque type baggage where religious rhetoric could be not even, I wouldn't say exploited, but it could be used. And maybe even this weird word that we throw around every now and then, the word propaganda. I mean, if you'd like, you can call it propaganda, but it definitely could be utilized here, even for the benefit of the church in this case, because the church currently is experiencing some really, really strange things that are taking place in Ukraine. So Medvedev could have, of course, utilized that. He did not. But still, like comparing his presentation to that of, say, the spokesperson of the Kremlin, Peskov. Unfortunately, Peskov's presentation was really weird. He kept saying, "Oh, the election's coming up, guys. Let's get excited. Let's vote for our president." And of course, he says that the Russian democracy is the best democracy in Europe. It's almost like a Borat skit or something. It's like American democracy is the best. He says Russian democracy is the fairest. It is the best. It's like, why are we emphasizing this silly thing, Mr. Peskov? Dmitry, it's not a good time for that, sir. So, of course, everyone has their little cliche sort of things that they keep doing, and Medvedev continues to sort of be the hawk at the forefront. He is the new Zhirinovsky. He does need to present these new futuristic designs, I think, for the Russian state. So this is completely in his lane. I'm happy that he's done that. And Putin, meanwhile, has continued to give really strong realist positions, especially his 2.5 hour Q&A that took place just over a week ago was very insightful. Again, big things such as nuclear weaponry was mentioned. Belarus was mentioned. Russian cooperation with Belarus is stronger than ever. And naturally, Lukashenko flexing his muscles now could be a sign of that as well. So again, we've seen Russian-Belarusian relations strengthen, especially over the Wagner crisis and things such as that last year. And moving forward, I think, regardless of if Belarus actually wants any of this northern Ukrainian land or not, I think Lukashenko will still play a part in the coming offensive, especially considering, well, we discussed the troop placements of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians permanently must keep at least 100 to 150,000 troops on that northern border, sort of watching Belarus just in case any moves are made. So that preoccupation is always kind of putting pressure, and even if it's just mental pressure, on the Ukrainian decision makers.
Yeah, you're right that Medvedev is kind of the new Zhirinovsky. They needed somebody to fill that role. So, I guess they demoted him on the actual hierarchy, but, elevated his voice in the media. So that's kind of what we've been seeing. You talk about the map, being fulfilled, of course. We have seen signs that the Ukrainians fear a Kharkov offensive from the Russians. And of course, the Russians have extensive forces built up all along the front line. The front line is being totally equalized, as they have talked about how it becoming united and having, no weak points, and even straightening out the line itself. It sounds like, they're having some map autism even along the front line command. But of course, in Ukraine, we've seen some crazy conscription videos. We see people in villages fighting conscription officers with axes, hitting them with their cars, all sorts of things. In Ukraine, the average age on the front line is 43, on top of the fact that we're seeing more and more women, which is just, it's just kind of gross to see. I don't even really like talking about it too much, but the fact that this is kind of the reality of the front line definitely presages some fairly large collapses, because if we've already seen, what we've seen from some of the elite brigades, the actual meat and potatoes of the young men of the Ukrainian people, and now we have these replacements, I can't imagine that they will be able to hold on for as long. But much in the other direction, I was in Russia and I was able to speak to some young soldiers that sing in the military choir at the Russian military cathedral, and they themselves are draftees, but they were like, yeah, no draftees actually even get sent to the front line. So there are no drafted members of the Russian military actually fighting on the front. It's just professional soldiers, prisoners that have taken contracts, or other people that have taken what they consider to be, well, at least what the guys I was talking to considered to be fairly good contracts. And these guys, ironically enough, had been to the front line as draftees because their choir goes and sings to the people there. So they had been some of the few draftees that may have been super close to the front, but it definitely a very different situation going on in Russia than in Ukraine, which are, really scraping the bottom of the barrel and really just putting their people through hell, whereas no such parallel is occurring in Russia. So take that for what it's worth, I guess. That's a frontline report from me. But this Kharkov offensive, again, it would be reclaiming all of the land that Ukraine took in their only real successful counteroffensive, and that was summer 2022. So it's very likely that will be what happens. And if that happens in conjunction with a Belarusian, some kind of pincer maneuver there from the north, it would be very interesting, to say the least. And if that then takes a bunch of Ukrainian troops and energy from the southern fronts, then that could allow them to perhaps push to Odessa and connect to Transnistria and Moldova via the land, and ultimately respond to all of these calls from these republics for aid and assistance against what they perceive as Moldovan and ostensibly NATO, aggression on their territory. But speaking of aggression, we see Macron in France becoming kind of the number one NATO aggressor for some reason. It kind of came out of nowhere. I don't really know exactly why. Perhaps it has to do with some of the situation with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Perhaps it has to do with Africa because there was a coup in Chad, which again we don't really know exactly which side was behind the coup and which side was on the other side. But France has, lost 5, 6 plus direct, proxy countries to Russian forces in Africa. So there's a myriad of reasons why Macron may be the one to want to see Russia fully defeated, but he was talking about French troops in Ukraine. He kind of walked that back, but he was really going full bellicose. And this comes as, President Biden gives his State of the Union with the Prime Minister of Sweden present as they enter NATO. That was, I believe, March 11th will be when they are officially completely in, but it's all been signed. It's already happening. So NATO has expanded. It's all official. And at the same time, we see one of the largest, NATO countries with one of the more powerful NATO militaries talking about just directly fighting Russia. So it's a very interesting development, of course. And this comes right after he addressed, the Grand Lodge of France. So perhaps we'll get, Napoleonic Wars, Freemasonry versus, Russian Empire round 2.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and look, realistically, Macron doing this whilst the news from the front lines is so dire for Ukraine. For example, like the US just recently, right? It's been so the F-16s, the Ukrainians are training on them, right? They're using their new Top Gun planes, but now that they've learned how to, operate Abrams tanks, Macron is watching this take place. At least at that point, when he gave that speech, the first Abrams has gone down. $6 million US tanks, and these are like really pretty machines, big cannons, things like that, taken down by a $500 drone by a Russian from the motorized infantry brigade, and the Russians hand sign was Kolovrat, which means spinning wheel. It's like a Slavic sort of swastika, right? So literally getting trolled by Russian 20-year-olds flying like really cheap, under 1,000. Like the drones cost less than certain people's phones, and they're flying these drones into $1 million tanks, destroying them. I mean, this is just ridiculous. And of course, Germany is experiencing all this internal strife. Hungary is, even based on the recent Tucker Carlson interview, is not interested in supporting Zelensky. It's openly stated that. Greece is completely weakened. Turkey is still kind of like bedbound, focusing on Palestine, Israel. There isn't really a NATO country besides France that can, and the US, which can really show its teeth. But again, US is distracted by Israel, Palestine. Germany's busy, like with its internal strife, and I mean, it's trying to ban all the right-wing parties, unfortunately. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has made a really interesting statement regarding that after the leaking of the German officer tapes, which again were quite explicit. That half-an-hour tape that was leaked, and we're talking about some German officers were meeting up in Singapore somewhere for a business meeting. So these are officers of the German military, and their private discussions were somehow leaked, or they were obtained by the Russian Foreign Ministry, I guess, or Russian intelligence somehow obtained them. And the Russians published these tapes, and of course, in these tapes, the German officers quite explicitly, Conrad, they talk about this shipment of weapons, troops supporting Ukraine, escalating the war to some extent. It's just really hawkish discourse from the Germans. Very unfortunate. This is, and of course, the German newspapers instantly, for some reason, like the famous German liberal newspaper Bild, straight away confirmed the story. They could have just said, hey, the Russians have faked some audio. But no, they confirmed it. They said, yeah, these are our guys. And yeah, we're keen on supporting Ukraine. And naturally, unfortunately, Maria Zaharova says certain really confusing statements, such as, I don't think Germany was denazified enough, right? So as this is happening, Macron is, for lack of a better word, chimping out, like in a comedic fashion, saying, hold me back, guys, hold me back. I'm going to confront Russia on my own, despite the fact that the French Navy is really showing its ineptitude, actually stopping the Houthis at the moment in the Red Sea during Operation Prosperity Guardian. So France is really not experiencing the best of times, even given the protests we discussed last year. The struggle in Africa with its economic sort of capitalist colonies going down abroad. France is really in a weird, really bad state. Religiously speaking, the Catholic Church is also in not the best position, despite the fact that France hasn't been Catholic for a long time, right? It's been a Masonic republic for at least 200 years at this point. So yeah, it's just not looking good for the French Republic. It looks like they really need some reinvigorating sort of influence from Christianity, but that can only take place when the French people actually awaken. And under the influence and the leadership of this weirdo Macron, who married his high school teacher, again, will this take place? And can you imagine how Medvedev and how Putin view Macron in person? Like, they probably think he's a clown, he's a weirdo. Like, worse than Sunak, they think he's probably a pervert. And again, when he makes these sort of like when he this displays these behaviors, I don't think anybody takes him seriously. So of course Medvedev would post and react to Macron's. It's almost like a theater in a way. So Medvedev acts like Zhirinovsky, Macron acts like a child, and everybody sort of benefits. And of course, we have news to speak about. Unfortunately, this is what politics has become in Europe ever since the beginning of the SMO, because again, Europe, the way it reacts to supporting Ukraine is completely irrational. And so, of course, they need to behave like so publicly.
Well, and this is somewhat recent. Macron seems to have made Odessa his red line. He says that French troops will fight Russia if Russia advances towards Odessa. So I don't know if are we getting it seems that the Russia versus France, who will Macron is really embracing the Napoleon arc. Perhaps, he has antichrist aspirations. I don't think he's quite beloved enough to be that person, but this is very strange escalation of rhetoric. You mentioned Maria Zakharova's comments. I don't think she realizes that it's because Germany has been so thoroughly denazified that Germany is so willing to fight you in Ukraine and support the Globo Homo project there. But we even saw that German ship, I believe it was the Hessen, completely misfire a missile in some kind of Houthi operation and totally damage the ship. I don't know if it's reported that it had to leave the Red Sea, but I'm sure it had to go to port somewhere, or at least receive significant help from U.S. forces in the region, because it's much like the French Navy. The Germans have also been embarrassing themselves in the Red Sea, and the U.S., like we said, there have been some close calls. The Houthis have forced U.S. ships to engage their closest fire defenses. So it's all World War III really is here. But before we move, well, I guess we are moving into the Caucasus region, of course. There has been some strange terrorist activity in Ingushetia. We're going to talk about ISIS's return in a second. But Dmitry, what is going on in Ingushetia? Like, why are we suddenly seeing, Chechnya, Dagestan, they seem to be, 100% behind the SMO, but why would the least relevant, Muslim republic suddenly decide to go terrorism mode?
Well, look, the landscape of ancient Khazaria has always been tumultuous. I think for the people living there, it's been quite tough. And the people living there really, even the Muslims themselves don't view Chechens, Ingushas, Dagestanis as even completely Islamic. In fact, there is almost a separate type of Sunni Muslim over there where, even their theologians throughout history were not viewed exactly by the Arab Muslims as sort of pertaining to mainstream sort of religious views. They're always seen as like these weird, either old believer types or maybe like semi-schismatic. So the people of the mountains have always sort of had different views on the outside world. But Ingushetia in particular, this land has been terrorized during the first and second Chechen campaigns by the terrorists who actually came from Chechnya. And, that's like a whole different story, frankly. But this is what began President Putin's presidency, right? So in the second Chechen campaign, and of course his ending of it with, allying himself with the Kadyrov clan. And it's very interesting that in Ingushetia, allegedly, these are ISIS cells that were activated. They took control of several apartments. I believe it was one or two apartment buildings. And the Russian Spetsnaz, the local guards, needed to move in and actually, in like a Counter-Strike, Tom Clancy type fashion, Jack Reacher style, needed to take out these terrorists, and they killed, I believe, 5 people. Perhaps some were apprehended. If they were, I would imagine they'd be moved to some Russian black sites and probably interrogated in the most extreme fashions. Because given that if they were ISIS, or if certain, again, like we'll mention, like ISIS is being activated at the moment, and who knows who exactly those initial sort of fire starters were during the Chechen conflict. Those are still questions typically unanswered by modern historians in the 90s, actually, who exactly begun those acts in the Northern Caucasus region. So again, who's starting it now is a big question mark. Could be those proxies or sort of frozen cells which were there the entire time. And frankly, it's not just the Islamic cells. Unfortunately, this land, especially Chechnya itself, currently under the enforcement of Kadyrov and his people, is really a place where Christianity, unfortunately, hasn't spread thoroughly enough. And so the culture there is very, very different. They have things such as blood feuds, family feuds. I think probably like a good percentage of Chechnya has a personal blood feud against Kadyrov and his people, so that just because his dad killed one of their cousins or one of their uncles, and so they need to obtain revenge. It's very Old Testament-esque, similar to what we see in Israel when the Israelis, of course, sort of strike these sort of internal deals and of vengeance against the Palestinians. Allegedly somebody killed somebody, so they need to an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth type of situation. So that's what exists in these particular areas. So to actually bring peace to the Northern Caucasus was very, very difficult. Frankly, what Kadyrov is doing is actually quite a good thing. So hopefully he can still, at least while the SMO is ongoing, the hope is that this area doesn't engulf itself in flames again. But the possibility is always there. And this is the first time in decades, so since the Georgian War, I would say, where with Russia's involvement, since we've seen any action in this particular area. So again, it's very, very, the Russians need to be super cautious and just moving south. Like, who knows? Azerbaijan is always active. Azerbaijan is, very deeply in cooperation with Russia. But again, who knows exactly on whose side they are, and who knows who's starting these, who's operating these particular terrorist cells inside of the Russian Federation. Very, very dangerous stuff.
Yeah, we're about to talk about Armenia, Azerbaijan. I just wanted to briefly tie in. Of course, we talked about France's red line. Of course, they have actually about to sign a defense pact with Moldova. So perhaps they perceive aggression on Odessa as something that would fall under their new pact, which I'm sure will involve French troops going into Pridnestrovia and Gagauzia should things go wrong. So again, the Macron development is strong. And of course, Macron is likely the person behind these issues in the Caucasus with Armenia and Azerbaijan. He's the main person, dangling the carrot in front of Pashinyan about being accepted by the European community, being accepted by the West, maybe joining NATO. And of course, if he thinks they're going to join NATO, that's why he wants to pull out of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is what Pashinyan has pledged to do and has greatly somewhat upset the Russians. Of course, we already knew that he threw the last CSTO meeting into disarray by not, I think, reaffirming the rules or whatever it was that you're supposed to do, procedure-wise when you begin these meetings and whatnot. But there's some statements from Sputnik Armenia that talks about Lavrov. He said that statements by Armenian leadership make Russia think about how to take them into account in its own practical steps. The head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, in a conversation with journalists in Antalya, said that he could not confirm reports about discussing the feasibility of the presence of Russian border guards at Yerevan airport. He also repeated that progress in relations between Baku and Yerevan will depend on how honestly the trilateral agreements are implemented. According to Lavrov, Baku confirms this readiness in conversations. And while the Russians are the more neutral party here, it's tough because we do see, the Azeris have literally torn down the government buildings in Artsakh, in Nagorno-Karabakh, like the main government building in Stepanakert. They just tore it down completely. They claimed it was not architecturally sound, but it was like the nicest, biggest building in the city. So I'm a bit skeptical of that. We've seen videos of Azeri soldiers, shooting and gunning down, Christian cemeteries in the region and whatnot. And now, again, reports, it seemed to indicate that 31 towns in Armenia proper, like not in exclaves, not in Nagorno-Karabakh, in like actual Armenia, internationally recognized, are still in some way occupied by Azeri forces. And I don't know the 100% accuracy of all of that, but a lot of this was confirmed by the Armenian government. So it seems that, in some regard, the Armenians are correct about just the complete kind of stranglehold that the Turks and the Azeris together have around the Armenian nation and their desire to shrink it even more, which again, it's one of the smallest countries in the region, and a region already full of small countries. So it's a very interesting development. It seems that the Russians are kind of throwing their lot in with Azerbaijan, which again, for reasons discussed in point, at the beginning of this episode with Israel and Azerbaijan, that's less than desirable for patriots, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I think just the long-term aspirations of supporting a country which is definitely pro-Zionist and definitely has some future a larger Turkic project, which again could involve, siding with Kazakhstan and even some Turkic-related smaller peoples inside of Russia itself, which, could bring up some separatist types tendencies. But yeah, Pashinyan, of course, definitely has reasons to be concerned because so on the 13th of February, it's been confirmed that 4 Armenian soldiers have officially died fighting Azerbaijani border guards. So there was a small arms conflict even taking place. So we have literal Armenian armed soldiers dying at the moment. So in fact, the conflict seems to, at least this was called a skirmish, and of course the conflict has not definitely restarted this week, but this was 3 weeks ago. There's been no reaction. Pashinyan, like on behalf of Armenia, personifying it, is still calling for assistance from abroad, kind of like the boy who cried wolf. And he's been doing this for the past year or so. And in fact, Azerbaijan, as we mentioned a few weeks ago, could actually see this as the opportunity to perhaps, while the world is so much in strife, this conflict happening in various countries, could see this as an opportunity to move forward and perhaps take more of Armenia than it initially bargained for all those years ago at the beginning of the conflict prior to COVID. So frankly, this may even be the best time for Azerbaijan to actually act, considering France still hasn't provided all of the aid that it's promised. Macron is hesitating. Macron is focusing on Odessa and other places. Surely the European Union and NATO cannot multitask in this particular situation. Azerbaijan seems to have Erdogan's support, seems to have Russian support. And of course, there are no tensions with Iran. Iran's really focused on its BRICS cooperation as well as funding the Russian war effort in the SMO. So it's kind of the perfect scenario, actually. In fact, the Jewish media, well, I'm sorry, the Israeli media is also very pro Azeri at the moment. So it's almost like the best of both worlds to sort of strike at the smaller, weaker, and unfortunately Christian target in that particular region of Anatolia. Very sad for the innocent Armenians who are currently getting hurt and who may even get hurt when this situation inevitably does escalate. Because I feel like Aliyev and his people will not stop in terms of pushing their interests forward. Maybe the hand of Erdogan is behind them, maybe it's the hand of Netanyahu, we're not sure, but certainly there's a big kipper or even a small one on the head of whoever's making these decisions.
Oh, it's unfortunate because at the same time we see intense Israeli aggression on the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem, which I think they had their seminary bulldozed. They've had, some of the most aggression, them, of course, and then the Orthodox and Catholics and the other Christian quarters. They've been facing intense settler and, government aggression, much like the Muslims who want to worship on the Temple Mount, at the Dome of the Rock. The Jews are fully expanding into the West Bank, even in the city of Jerusalem itself, despite the large presence of the other people there. And you talk about Turkey, we talk about, they're obviously waging a big campaign against the Kurdish terrorists in the east of their country as well as in Syria. They of course still have their incursion, their buffer zone that they have into Syria, but now it seems that ISIS has returned. And we hear of Russian airstrikes, not even against ISIS, but even just against the old Al-Nusra Front and the old Free Syrian Army proxies that were fighting against Assad. The Russians have been conducting airstrikes there against them. The Russians have also engaged, the Russians and, the Syrian Arab Army have engaged ISIS now in multiple areas. I believe there's reports of 40 deceased in some of these places. So again, ISIS is back. I'm sure this has nothing to do with those in Ingushetia and, all of these random, Wahhabists erupting on the peripheries of the Russian sphere of influence. I'm sure they don't have anything to do with each other. I'm sure that it's all organic and that a bunch of people in Syria just really decided that they want to see the Islamic State return, and that kind of caliphate is just what they need right now. I'm sure it's just ridiculous that people really believe that some of these movements in the Middle East are organic, especially in the midst of how many of these groups, I mean, when you have, the Islamic resistance in Iraq and Syria, these Iranian groups Iran-backed groups that all united, and then suddenly even more extremist Wahhabists on the other side emerge, like it just is, it boggles the mind that anybody believes any of it is organic, but most people have no idea how the world works. Unlike you, World War Now listeners, that's why you tune into the show, so you understand what's really going on. But yep, ISIS is back. I don't know if that will have any implications for Europe, because remember, when ISIS flares up, suddenly there seem to be more terrorist attacks in the West as well, so we'll be sure to keep an eye on that. But unless you have anything else to say about the Caucasus, Syria, Dimitri, I'm ready to move on to some of these Turkish, Greece, maritime issues, which may seem esoteric, but are very relevant to World War Now.
Yeah, I think just for the listeners, maybe anyone tuning in for the first time, like don't feel burdened by the fact that you need to learn what's happening in the Middle East. It's a very complex situation which has been building for hundreds of years and definitely has been exacerbated by the ending of the sort of Western colonial model, especially the division of the Middle East has been a really big deal, especially since the division, as you see, the borders of Middle Eastern countries have been drawn across not tribal, ethnic, sort of, or even religious lines, but frankly, by what some Freemason in a cabinet designed in either London or Paris at the time. So, frankly, a lot of it is definitely artificial. It's even more artificial in some of the borders designated by the Soviet Union, for example, that of Kazakhstan or Ukraine or even Belarus. So, we definitely have similar issues. I think Russians and Middle Easterners could agree that, in fact, these Freemasonic designs of border drawing has, in fact, affected both of our sort of civilizations equally negatively. And in fact, now that the Middle East is, over the last 100 years, has been trying to make sense of where exactly each of these countries belongs and where each tribe should be occupying and living, which land, of course, the injection, it's like the outside virus, the artificial Wuhan lab COVID style thing is injected into the atmosphere, and that's the ISIS Wahhabists, Salafists, who essentially are basing their philosophy on things which are not even mainstream in Islam, right, Conrad? We don't see this in the actual Arabic states, not around Mecca, Medina, or even around Al-Aqsa, not even in the old Jerusalem community of Muslims who've lived there for hundreds of years, sort of uninterrupted despite the Zionist harassment. This is not where these movements arise from. They arise in the desert where essentially all these terrorists have been occupying these areas post fall of Saddam. It's being grown in vats overseas and these black sites created by, unfortunately, the US deep state. And they fight for the interests of the deep state, of the New World Order, of the future, of course, reigning globalist, whatever super entity that's being created or that potentially will be created in the future. And they fight against Iran, Syria, Russia, and all the sort of powers which want, I guess, multipolarity and freedom. That's in summary, what's happening at the moment. And so we cover that from week to week. But yes, there are always these ancient conflicts, right? And by ancient, I mean something like Greece and Turkey. These conflicts which go back hundreds of years, and there is so many. It's this Gordian knot which simply cannot be unwinded by saying, well, let's just be friends. Frankly, the only thing that can really bring, I think, Anatolian Turks and Greeks from the islands together is probably Christianity. In fact, Christian forgiveness and the ability of Christian love to move on from actual conflict, because what we see building again and again, and even in the prophecies, it's stated very clearly, there will be a new war. Turks will begin taking Greek islands. They'll be moving forward and actually occupying Greek land. And the fact that the Greeks dislike the Turks so much and haven't actually evangelized and written or translated even there's some of their religious and spiritual Orthodox Christian books into the Turkish language in order to actually make the Turks more like them, spread the word of God, actually bring forth some sort of amicability between the peoples, has again only exacerbated this particular issue. And moving forward, I think the fruits of that will be seen in the coming conflict. And this is constantly building. We see these reports, right, from ex-Greek military officials, ex-Greek politicians. They're always warning us in the news and possibly exaggerating in some cases, right, Conrad? But they're saying the Turks are preparing their navy, the Turks are preparing their army, they're doing these military operations. And frankly, I think the only thing that's really, I think one of the facts that is true is that Turks and Erdogan, they're not actually involved anywhere at the moment militarily. They're one of the only countries whose military and whose powerful navy is actually free to act. In fact, they're just training at the moment, maneuvering, building up their military, and they have designed their new anti-air defense systems for the first time. They've told the Russians, we don't want to buy your defense systems. The US has stated they're not selling any Patriots, so their new defense system is going to apparently called Cyber, and some new Turkish technology they're designing. So they're actually building up their own military-industrial complex as we speak right now against Greece. Meanwhile, Mitsotakis is visiting Zelensky, and he's talking about a future gay Europe, which, again, doesn't really inspire anyone. So it's a really sort of curious situation. Exactly how will the Greeks react, and how will this coming conflict pan out?
Well, the big update, of course, and those of you that pay attention, and you may watch the Orthodox Christian Miracles and Prophecies channel with Panagiotis, he's great. You may read these things on your own. Of course, if you listen to the show, many of y'all are keeping up with St. Paisios prophecies, but you may remember that a big part of this has to do with, there's a discussion of the movement of a 12-mile nautical border regarding international waters, with Turkey getting shrunk to a 6-mile border, and it effectively seems that has happened. This is from Newsbreak, which is a Greek source. It talks about the Aegean issue between Greece and Turkey. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's letter to Congress regarding the issue was leaked, and many of Greece's desires regarding 12-mile territorial waters from their island borders with Turkey, they say that doesn't have any merit, and it basically appears that multiple of these islands, Lesvos, Lemnos, some of these ones very close to the Turkish Anatolian coast, will be regarded as international airspace and waters for Turkish military aircraft. And again, America sells aircraft to both Turkey and Greece as NATO allies, of course. Greece has American F-35s, and Turkey has a very large fleet of American F-16s. And the Greeks, are complaining now that Turkish F-16s will be able to fly over many of these islands. And in the past, Turkey has complained that Greece has built up these islands militarily, despite the fact that is against one of the treaties, that gives Greece these islands. They're not allowed to militarize them. But it seems that both sides are in the business of of violating these treaties. But, specifically what has happened is, this letter from Blinken, it states that Greece's request for 12-mile territorial waters is unnecessary and that they do not have such rights. It is said that Greece's application for 10 miles of airspace within 6 miles of the territorial waters is also invalid. And it is stated that the area beyond 6 miles is international airspace and Greece can't claim sovereignty over those areas. So, again, this is something specifically that St. Paisios mentioned and has been talked about for years, this 6 miles to 12 miles. And it appears that it's beginning to happen. And, that forebodes some fairly disastrous events. But, it's talked about, the Russians and the Turks, they'll turn on each other. Like Russia will turn on Turkey, like the snap of a finger, like it will be like nothing. And right now, again, we do see Turkey engaged in Syria. We see Russia engaged in Syria. Russia and Turkey, again, they have proxies in Libya. In Africa, some of these other countries like Sudan, Russia and Turkey are not on the same side. And of course, Turkey is a NATO member. But again, we talk about the Greeks, maybe needing to rise up against their government. Perhaps that could, perhaps standing against the neoliberalism of Mitsotakis could, allow them to further ingratiate themselves with the Russians, who it seems are the only feasible enemy of their major rival Turkey. But this is a very interesting development indeed, because nobody's really talking about this. This isn't going to make headlines. For most people, this is just an irrelevant, weird, Aegean Sea nautical border fiasco that's going to keep going back and forth. But it does appear that, a prophecy was fulfilled, and either it is, the process of that being fulfilled has started, or this is actually, this is it. We're going to see the fallout of this, because if Erdogan and Turkey want to take advantage of this, we could see some dramatic, Turkish jet flights over some of these Greek islands. So we're going to be watching that very closely. But Dimitri, unless you have anything to say regarding that, I think we can talk about Metropolitan Neophytos and some of these other Greek bishops.
Yeah, I think it's time to move into a realm of morality and ethics, which again, these are the cornerstones of all the things we speak about, because these, not following the laws of God and not following exactly the commandments given to us by the Holy Trinity, by the Lord, actually lead us to all these bad outcomes, which essentially, well, for every country, for each their own, naturally, everyone has their own challenges, but it seems like the world is really heading into a bad place. We've been covering it week by week, and in fact, the hierarchs have been trying to warn us, hierarchs from various countries, Russia, Ukraine, Greece, even the US. So from all over the world, the clergymen have been telling us as to what's been happening, and in fact, their calls have been ignored. And here's a really good example, right? So TASS Media, from which we've read the famous interview by the Russian newspaper of the Metropolitan Neophytos of Morpho, right, who we speak about quite often. He is essentially a living saint, a very powerful hierarchy. We delivered a very powerful A4 episode, and I say powerful because the people we spoke about were powerful and righteous, and Metropolitan Neophytos was one of those people. And so going back to the TASS interview, in the TASS interview, me and Conrad read out segments of it. It seemed quite good, and in fact, reading it, I actually noticed a little detail that perhaps the interview itself was somewhat very controlled. And I thought, well, maybe Metropolitan Neophytos is putting on a very kind face for the Russians, who we know still sometimes censor some of their media stories in order to appeal to the more, shall we say, to the minorities living within their nations and living in certain positions. But nevertheless, a friend of ours, a friend of World War Now, a real supporter, a longtime assistant as well from South Africa, Felicia, and you know who you are. So Felicia has kindly, and she's of course a member of the Greek Orthodox Church, she provided us with the actual translation, the uncensored interview from Metropolitan Neophytos, and what have we seen, Conrad? I mean, I'm just going to read out these 3 paragraphs very briefly. So these are the uncensored words of Metropolitan Neophytos, and of course there's a lot more which probably has been released somewhere, but these are just the first 3 segments. So Metropolitan Neophytos says, what do Zelensky, Macron, and Mitsotakis have in common? They are 3 Jewish seeds. I have nothing against Jews. I am not anti-Semitic, since our Theotokos is from a Judean family, and all the apostles were Jews. I know very well what Jewish people are, and their contribution to God's plan means. But at some point in history, these people that spread all over the world created in Ukraine a nation-state called the Khazarian nation. It is made up of Russian Jews with a pseudo-Jewish religion pretending to be the Jews of the Old Testament, according to their religion. Metropolitan Neophytos read an excerpt from the Gerontissa Galactia's book, who said that she told him the following. A few things will happen, and in Cyprus the Turks will pass through and come to Crete. The Turks will also come here. They will come secretly and quickly, but they will have little success. Then Russia will deal with them once and for all. So Metropolitan Neophytos reads a prophecy of Gerontissa Galactica, and naturally, in the first paragraph, mentions very, very clearly as what his thoughts are about the elites that run some of these nations. And this has been completely censored, unfortunately, in the Russian TASS interview, which I understand it's a government agency, but at some point, at some point, the unfiltered Orthodox faith, especially when we speak, these are the words of really righteous hierarchs of our time, they need to be able to reach the common people without even me and Conrad reporting them. This should come directly from Metropolitan Neophytos to the people, without middlemen, so to speak, right? Without, of course, even assistance, good people like Felicia helping us out here. So it's a little bit confusing as to why it's being censored, but I think we know the answer. And this is just one of those stories, right, Conrad? It's sort of, it's the little kipper speaking. We're not speaking from the heart, we're speaking from the wallet. And this is especially important because, again, when we mention countries like Greece, there are these criticisms of, Greek hierarchs not speaking out or Greek clergymen not speaking out against the current gay marriage laws. And in fact, what we notice is, again, we're not biased against Greeks, or we're not pro-Russian, we're not anti-Ukrainian. We take a very general stance. We actually try not to judge as much as possible. We just try to relay the news to the viewers and listeners. And this is just one of those examples where, unfortunately, the Russian media has simply made a very crucial mistake. And in fact, it may be very disrespectful, actually, editing and censoring an interview of an Orthodox bishop.
Well, yeah, because I'm sure they had people that know Greek and Russian, and those people just listened to the Greek and only relayed in Russian what they thought people wanted to hear. So again, not everybody can speak Greek. It's a less commonly spoken language among non-Greeks. So we're thankful to our Greek subscribers. We always want to hear from our Greek followers because there's so much in Greek that we need to have translated. Because of course we've got the Russian kind of handled on our own end, but we need more Greek, we need more Arabic and some of these other things that, they're very important documents and whatnot in these languages. So don't be afraid to reach out if you are proficient and fluent. But we're hopefully going to read more about Gerontissa Galactica, as she has really talked about a lot of these prophecies, a lot of this issue specifically, and the fact that this is something that Metropolitan Neophytos revealed regarding Cyprus and Turkey and Russia right as this prophecy from St. Paisios about the 6 nautical miles of territorial waters from the Greek islands, that was fulfilled. This is all getting very interesting. And this is one of the main reasons we started World War Now. It's been, this year it'll be 2 years since doing the show, and we've been on prophecy watch so that you guys can, not have to worry about it too much. And it seems that things are very much heating up in the directions that we have sort of predicted they will go. So we hope to continue to be accurate in our analysis. But you mentioned the Greek bishops and some of their stalwartness. Of course, a third bishop, I don't know if we even reported on the second, of course. We originally reported on Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus excommunicating all of the Greek MPs that voted for the sodomy marriage law and have ushered that era into the Orthodox world by force against the will of the people. He, of course, has been followed up by Metropolitan Seraphim of Kythera, who has also excommunicated them in his metropolis, and so has Metropolitan Nectarios of Corfu. So these are 3 very relevant, very well-known metropolises who have now completely barred these degenerates from taking communion in their regions. And again, I'm sure that these people all have some bishop that they know will always give them communion somewhere in the Greek Orthodox world. I guess if worst comes to worst, they can always come to America, and I'm sure Elpidophoros will give all of them as much communion as they would like. But the fact that more and more Greek metropolitans and bishops are following up, on the bravery of Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus is very bold to see. And of course, we already knew about Metropolitan Seraphim of Kythera, Metropolitan Nectarios, because these were all people that stood strongly both either against ecumenism or in the COVID issues. We've heard their names before. If you go back and listen to some of our earlier episodes, I'm sure we've talked about all of them. But, just goes to show you, converts, people make fun of more, they say converts are LARPing by taking names like Seraphim and Nectarios. It's like, look, these are powerful names. You don't really see many Seraphims and Nectarioses, falling for the nonsense of this world. So I think, Saint Nectarios and, Saint Seraphim, the multiple Saint Seraphims that we have, they are really powerful intercessors in these latter days. So I don't want to hear any hate on people, taking those names. Not that, I'm Conrad in the church as well. So it's not like, maybe I should have been a Nectarios. Just kidding. But this is all a good sign, of course, despite the fact that we did hope to see even more civil resistance and civil uprising from the Greek people themselves. Hopefully, more and more of them, the peaceful Greek Orthodox people in the rural areas, they are writing letters to their bishops, and more bishops, at the very least, can follow suit to where we can have, so many to where when a synod is called, it can be something that is really, really addressed and something that can have, true ecumenical power behind it. So we're grateful to see all of that. And outside of the Greek world, or rather, I guess, within the Greek world, as Patriarch Bartholomew would like to see it, the persecutions continue in Ukraine. At the same time, though, we see, much like we talk about Moldova being, this escalation as another country gets involved, ecclesiologically, we've seen Romania, Moldova kind of leach into the Ukraine sphere. And we mentioned earlier how this might have to do with a future map, even, Medvedev talking about Romania taking territory in Ukraine. So, Dimitri, I'd love your thoughts on the Romanian church issue.
Yeah, the Romanian Church had a recent synod council in the late dates of February. The Romanian Church came together and came out with a decision to expand the Bessarabian Metropolitanate, which essentially spreads out. This is already, I guess, Romanian control of Moldova. So Romania does have influence. I guess the Romanian Orthodox Church does have influence in the land of Moldova, and in fact, they've made prior statements where they've said they're happy to share Moldova between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Romanian Orthodox Church. They've said we're brotherly patriarchates in Moldova, frankly, because it's politically sovereign. It doesn't belong to neither Romania nor Russia. It could, in fact, have the presence of both jurisdictions on its land. So that's the Romanian opinion. The Russian opinion is a bit more, shall we say, defensive. The Russians state that Moldova belongs to the Russian Orthodox Church jurisdictionally. There was actually several dioceses in Moldova that belonged to, the Russian Holy Synod and during the Russian Empire. So in fact, that's the history there. But the Romanian Orthodox Church has gone even further, and under the leadership of its patriarch and the other bishops presiding on the synod, the Romanian Orthodox Church has said they're going to, in fact, expand into Ukraine proper. So not just Moldova, but over the border, not even into Pridnestrovia, Transnistria, but apparently Western Ukraine, just like in Putin's little story where he told you of like the big hat Hungarians who sound a lot like rabbis, there are apparently Romanians living in Western Ukraine too. So for those of us who maybe don't have our ethnography or our sort of geo-ethnic data up to date, there are in fact a lot of Romanian communities in Western Ukraine. And so the Romanian Church has stated that, look, given the current situation in the Ukraine, the sort of various schisms taking place and certain existence, I guess, of multiple jurisdictions, you can say the Ecumenical Patriarch has a jurisdiction in, a schismatic one in the face of Epiphany, Sergei Dumenko, as well as there's also a Patriarch of Kiev, Filaret. So there's all kinds of weird sects and things going on, and Romania also now wants to participate. So now Romania is formally expanding into Ukraine. This is really strange, and again, it could be a double-edged sword here. On one hand, yes, Romania could be catering to some of its people, but again, Romania and the Romanian Church could be causing a rift with the already, I would say, upset and very stressed out Moscow Patriarchate, where Patriarch Kirill, he's already multitasking on several fronts, trying to keep the Russian Orthodox Church active in its overseas diocese, trying to not do, the Russian Church needs to not fall under various sanctions in Western Europe. There are all these complexities involved with Russian churches acting in countries such as Belgium, France, things like that. It's really complicated, and this just adds additional stress. And this on top of all the current persecution as well taking place. Metropolitan Onufriy of Kiev, he hasn't reacted to this expansion of the Romanian Church, this sort of illegal, uncanonical expansion. So we're kind of left with this weird situation where, in fact, Ukraine is turning into this free-for-all land where various jurisdictions will now act, at least the jurisdiction of three separate patriarchates, Moscow, Constantinople, and Romania, which really, really bizarre situation on the ground. I would say the only positive, and this is, of course, a really 600D chess scenario, is if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which, again, the High Rada is attempting to completely ban it and close all the 20,000 Ukrainian parishes, but if they succeed, there will be only one canonical church that the average Ukrainian can access if they want to stay on, with Christ under the grace of the Holy Spirit, and that would be the Romanian Orthodox Church. Funny enough, not the Church of Dumenko, not the Church of false Patriarch Filaret, or all these other weirdos, or God forbid the Roman Catholic Uniate Church, or all these other sects existing in Ukraine, but it would be the Romanians. Which again, this wasn't the first thought, I think, of the Romanian Church giving the Ukrainians a plan. I want to say Plan Z, because that's what it literally would need to come after the closing of 20,000 odd churches. It's just a very strange scenario. And in fact, I lightened up on the subject when I first heard about this news. I was extremely offended because, again, this is like weird Romanian expansion into Russian jurisdictional land. But I think, given the current circumstances, it's understandable, and it could even be a temporary arrangement in order to keep the Romanians living in Ukraine happy and at least spiritually satisfied to some extent.
Yeah, I think in many ways this could have to do with some of this territorial realignment that we're seeing. And I want to report this before we move into our more final miscellaneous news items, is that both Poland and Moldova have suspended their participation in the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, which Russia did a year ago, I think even before, like around the time of the beginning of the special military operation. And for Moldova, this seems to prefigure possible military action against Pridnestrovia and Gagauzia. I mean, this would allow them to build up their military and take that issue on, because that issue is preventing them from even being eligible for NATO and European Union membership. And Poland, I mean, I don't think I need to spell it out. I think Poland perhaps entering into Western Ukraine and actually occupying it, and they'd have to make a big show of, holding some line, drawing a line in the sand against Russia, but I'm sure the Russians would be happy to abide by a far western line in the sand like that. So people are saying that dark times are coming, reporting on this. So it appears that, the far eastern states of NATO and the far eastern states of, the globalist empire's influence in Moldova, Romania, Poland, this is, we could be seeing escalations. Some of these territories change, perhaps, the Romanian church will be the only relevant church in New Romania, and then they can drive out the schismatics. While, again, we hear about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, many of the bishops are going directly under Patriarch Kirill. There are pro-UOC people that don't like that, so it's very dynamic as well. We're going to have to see how it plays out between the UOC and Russia as Russia gains more territory. But unless you have any thoughts, I wanted to briefly mention some stuff with Biden and the Rothschilds, but say your final thoughts, of course, on Ukraine and the church.
Yeah, only that there is more pressure on Metropolitan Theodosi of Cherkasy as well as Metropolitan Yevlogi of Sumy, despite the fact that both of these metropolitans have made it clear that they're not even the most pro-Russian hierarchs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Onufri. In fact, even Metropolitan Onufri, I would say, is probably one of the least pro-Russian hierarchs in the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So, in fact, that the persecution and I would say the Ukrainian feds at this point. So this is directly on the SBU Telegram channels. They're reporting and they're writing these stories against the two metropolitans. So Yevlogi has received a notice that they've stated that, look, the hero 5 points on apparently you're still commemorating Patriarch Kirill, and he stated that he, for personal reasons, has stopped commemorating Patriarch Kirill, even though the Russian Orthodox Church didn't bless anyone to stop the commemoration of their patriarch. So there's some really complex discussions taking place. So we have a metropolitan literally communicating directly with the Ukrainian feds through his a sort of press system. It's just really concerning because, again, all of these situations could end up in court. And given the fact that as soon as the Ukrainian church is completely banned legally and the High Rada passes all of the laws which they've already proposed and they've already sort of moving up and drafting, it's going to be a bit more complex for these hierarchs to actually stand their ground, like representing what jurisdiction, representing what religious sort of community. They'll need to really explain themselves to the authorities in such a legalistic, I guess, lawyery way in order to defend themselves from any further pressure, I would say, and the pressure on their parishioners as well as the clergy who are under them. It's just incredibly stressful. So hopefully going forward, we will have at least some clarity on exactly these laws, and maybe even Zelensky, through communication with, through pressure, through perhaps the United Nations or some of these other structures, or even the Russian coming sort of alleged peace deal, will maybe lay back and give some of these hierarchs and some of those being persecuted, those in prison, will at least lay off them for a little bit. So that's the hope, I would say.
Like you mentioned, the laws are going forward to where the entire UOC is going to be banned entirely. And it gets to the point where, again, we know there are many pro-Ukrainian people within the UOC that still have no interest in being under Russia. But when your entire church is literally made illegal, it's hard to not think that those people would at least start even begrudgingly hoping for what you could call Russian liberation. So I don't really understand the strategy on behalf of the Ukrainians. You're just creating pro-Russian people that will just be more amenable to Russian occupation and less likely to resist. So really not being well thought out. It's an interesting Pompeo project. Of course, Victoria Nuland, she has stepped down. She is going to be out as Undersecretary of State of Political Affairs. Of course, they're turning Tchaikovsky Street in Kiev into Victoria Nuland Street. So incredible. Another reason I think more local people will just realize that, man, Russia, just come now, just come and stop this madness, because that's, Bill Clinton statues in Kosovo level retardation, naming streets after Victoria Nuland, who we know her entire project in Ukraine was, Jewish ethnic grievance against Russia for her ancestors that were quote unquote, oppressed during the imperial period. So goodbye, good riddance, Victoria Nuland. You won't be missed. And in fact, they've replaced her with this guy, John Bass, who was actually the person that oversaw the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, U.S. leaving Ukraine entirely. Perhaps that's why Macron is talking about troops there. Perhaps that's why Poland and Moldova are leaving these treaties. It's because at the end of the day, the U.S. is about to be gone, and perhaps we're about to wash our hands of it and be like, Europe, do what you need to do. It won't be a NATO operation. It'll be a Euro operation. So very interesting times ahead. Of course, we're praying that things don't get hotter, but it appears that may be the direction things are heading. Joe Biden was very pro-Ukraine, actually, in his recent State of the Union, so maybe the U.S. will not be, maybe it's some last hurrahs before things really pull out, because the personnel side seemed to indicate that, like I just said, with Newland. But, he was very pro-weapons to Ukraine. He was very in favor of beating Russia there and everything. Of course, he was also, anti-Hamas, although he was in favor of, he was definitely better than the Republicans. Of course, Fuentes was reacting live to it, and he called Mike Johnson didn't stand up or clap for the entire speech until suddenly, Biden made some pro-Israel statements, and Mike Johnson stood right up. He was like, "Oh yes, sir, Massa, we love Israel," and just started clapping like a monkey for his masters in Israel, which we love to see, of course. But lately, Trump, he made his first real comments on the situation in Gaza, saying that Israel, needs to finish the job, which, nobody likes to hear. What does that even mean at this point? The entire place has been leveled. And then, again, I'm not saying I'm pro-Biden. He made some terrible statements. He came out in favor of an assault weapons ban. He made some very cringe statements about Laken Riley, the girl murdered by the illegal immigrant. He was like, we can't let this demonize illegals or legal immigrants. Like, why even bring it up, man? But at the same time, apparently after the speech, he, was giving comments to other congressmen and press people, and he said, I told him, BB, but you and I are going to have a come to Jesus moment about the ceasefire in Gaza. So kind of a based moment from Joe there, telling the Jew that he needs to come to Jesus and stop, bombing civilians. So again, the Gaza issue continues to be, nobody's good on it, unfortunately. You just can't make it anywhere in American politics and, stand up against Zog like that. So here we are. At the same time, Trump has made comments about how, Hezbollah, Hamas, they're very smart. So, maybe he will come out with a statement that will make the Jews mad again. But unfortunately, it seems that he is leaning into the rightward shift in Israeli politics, which is, injecting American politics with this Ziocon nonsense. We see, congressmen wearing IDF uniforms and that type of garbage. So hopefully Trump doesn't lean into that too much, but that may be how it goes. But, speaking of Israel, the keeper of the Balfour Declaration himself, has passed away. Dimitri, I think you had a take on the passing of our good friend Lord Rothschild.
Well, yeah. So the direct descendant, and I guess the Lord himself, Lord Jacob Rothschild, has in fact passed away at quite an elderly age, and this news comes only weeks after the King of the United Kingdom, Charles, has been again diagnosed with cancer already. This has been confirmed. And so the royal family is really in disarray, and suddenly this Lord Rothschild died, right? This is the real power behind the throne. You can say very clearly his family has been ruling the British Empire, I would say, from behind the scenes, ruling its money quite explicitly. Even mainstream history books really don't deny the power of this particular banking family. And naturally, their hand, as you just mentioned, was very, very evident in the creation of Israel in the first instance. But let's just consider who exactly his successor will be. So at this point, we're looking at the young Nathan, and in fact, he's not really young. in his late 40s, I believe, if not early 50s. And Lord Nathan Rothschild is the next in line of the British line of the Rothschild family. So he'll be ruling after his father. And of course, this particular tradition doesn't really support the taking over of women. So the Rothschild princesses, they usually married off the other powerful Jewish bankers in the various communities around the world. So that's usually how it goes, and the influence is spread through marriage. But yes, Lord Nathan, what's
Mhm.
interesting about him is, again, it links to both Trump and Russia. Lord Nathan is friends with Paul John Manafort Jr., so the famous attorney, now allegedly convicted felon. So one of Trump's lawyers, his lobbyist, who was involved in the big scandals following the 2016 election. But Paul Manafort was apparently friends directly with Nathan Rothschild. They did have some dealings in Ukraine, or at least this is what mainstream media usually alleges. But what's even more interesting, Conrad, is this, again, this Trumpian Putin link, which a lot of the time is turned into this weird caricature. But I think we're playing on it. We're playing on this link on a really different level. We're kind of going a little bit deeper because, as we know, we've spoken about Lord Nathan Rothschild in the past, when he was just the heir apparent, the crown prince of this dynasty. And he's visited Russia before. This man is linked to Russia very, very closely. He's best friends with Oleg Deripaska, the aluminium king of Russian industry. This is a Russo-Jewish oligarch. You can look him up. Deripaska has been very famous for, I mean, he's on the Forbes list. Probably has a lot more wealth than actually the list puts forward. He's been friends with Vladimir Putin personally, so kind of like his one of these personal oligarchs who's risen up, I would say, throughout the Putin years. He's not a 1990s oligarch. He's like a fresh 2000s. He's a fresh prince of the 2000s, and he's direct friends with Lord Nathan. And so they've personally visited Pskov a couple of times for some local elections. They probably have some friends there. They've been to Crimea. They've been seen on yachts in the Black Sea together. And so there's this weird link between Paul Manafort, Deripaska, who is directly linked with Putin, and Paul Manafort directly linked to Trump. So perhaps typically, like when we do speak about these powerful figures and we think, well, do they have personal connections? Are they messaging each other? Do they have phone numbers? Are there lines of communication? And we do see Putin meeting up with some of these powerful decision makers, such as Chief Rabbi Ber Lazar or Alexander Baroda of the Jewish community of Russia. And then Ber Lazar travels, meets Netanyahu, meets all these other rabbis. There are all these weird communications conspirology wise behind the scenes taking place. And in fact, I think this is another very obvious layer. This new Rothschild is a lot more, perhaps even a lot more pro-Russian in this weird way, or at least engaged with Russia in some capacity. There are oligarchs within Russia now who have direct links to him. How will this play out? How do Russians win from this? I'm not too sure, but this is just the reality we'll need to face. Maybe Lord Nathan Rothschild, the new sort of king of this dynasty, will make certain decisions in the future that will perhaps bring some new arrangements. We speak about heavenly Jerusalem. We have to keep in mind this family does not look to benefit Orthodox Christians, or they don't want to build Russia up. So what are they planning behind the scenes? We're not too sure, but let's just keep those links in mind as we move forward. But this is like typical conspiracy talk. But in fact, these are not theories anymore. This is just conspirology. This is the science of investigating the covert actions of elites behind the scenes.
Well, and there's some more esoteric connections, of course. Now that a Nathan Rothschild is at the head of the dynasty again, we got to remember the first progenitor of the Rothschild branch in England, the creator and charterer of the Bank of England itself, their central bank, was Nathan Rothschild, son of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, the original, Rothschild patriarch. And now that he is in charge, maybe there will be a return to form. Maybe this will be a very cataclysmic, a very consequential Rothschild reign, I guess you could say. But at the same time, a big news story, the royal family, you mentioned Charles having cancer now. They're all AWOL, Prince William, Princess Kate, they've all, canceled their public appearances. Apparently, they seem to be in hiding for whatever reason. So I don't know if Charles is about to die or something and William is about to have to become the king. That would be a very short reign. That'd be a really tough look for Charles. You were such an old prince, and then that's how it all ends. But, in true Anglican form, Charles has asked, the Orthodox to pray for him. I'm sure he's reached out to the Hindus and the others. But, Charles does have a close connection with Mount Athos. He's been many times, as his father was Greek. So, I guess it is important to pray for him regardless. But at the same time, as he is, of course, the head of this dynasty, as the King of England, he is both the head of the Anglican Church and the head of all the Freemasons, in England as well, which is, open and real. So it seems that I've heard behind the scenes that certain people talk to him about, controlling the Masons in a certain way and not having their influence, but he wasn't interested in that. So I think, Charles, in true Anglican Protestant fashion, has no problem being a Freemason. So it's a very, the dynasty in England and the situation there is very interesting. The city of London, the Rothschilds and their control of the bank there is still one of the central nodes of, the global American Israeli empire. So, Tel Aviv, London, DC, New York, these are the places to watch. And of course, you've got Moscow in there as the third Rome, kind of throwing it all into disarray. So it all comes together, right? We're reaching the end of the show here. The only other thing that was newsworthy was Nigeria is pledged to join the BRICS, so that's a big issue. The current most populated country, about to be surpassed by Ethiopia, I believe, but the most populous country in Africa. Actually, no, DRC may be about to surpass it, but either way, Nigeria, one of the largest countries in Africa, the economic powerhouse of Africa, pledging to join the BRICS, very, very big development. Obviously, here on the show, for obvious reasons, we believe that ultimately Russia does need to have some Western human capital behind it, whether that means Americans or, certain Slavic and European countries. We think that's important for their success, but, it's good to see this level of multipolarity rising, with these huge countries with these massive populations joining BRICS. It'll give a future BRICS currency, more relevance and whatnot. So that's about it. Those are most of the news items. Dimitri, I'll let you say anything you want to wrap up with, any points, and then we'll do the plugs.
I just want to briefly mention, unfortunately, as you said, funny enough, King Charles, like he just misses right on the last moment. So naturally, of course, he sends letters to various religious figures and the Anglican Church, which he is the head of, right, and all these other organizations. But he has to ask the Mount Athos monks to pray for him as well. But he asks the wrong monastery, the Vatapedi monastery, despite being one of the top 5 monasteries on Mount Athos. It is explicitly one of the few monasteries on Mount Athos which celebrates false metropolitan epiphany and the schism in Ukraine very, very strongly. In fact, the only monastery Charles writes to is the one which supports schismatics, and they actually invited like persecutors of Metropolitan Onufri and persecutors of the Ukrainian hierarchs, like literal people who've raided churches, to that Greek monastery on Athos and Vatapedi, and they've co-served with them. So like co-served with people who are not ordained. So it's essentially LARPing. It's a theater. It's really unfortunate that those are the people King Charles is sending a letter to. But as you've said, when it's all Masonic, it's definitely Masonic by, we're really going, like, we're highlighting it all here. And the last story, just want to ask a member of Parliament of the United Kingdom, George Galloway, if you can hear this message, please unblock me on Twitter, because I've not said anything against you. In fact, I've appreciated you following me, and I followed you back since 2023, and I support your sort of vision for sort of like a right-wing UK, like a UK which definitely stands up against Zionism. I think that's a really good message. And yes, your victory is, I understand you have different views on, multipolarity, and you think multipolarity may mean bringing in more immigrants, perhaps. We may disagree on that, and you may even praise Lenin and Stalin. But I think, Conrad, we can agree that even like the multipolarity project, we can maybe even cooperate with people whom we don't share 100% of the views with, right? And George Galloway is an example of that. It's like he won the election in the UK. He's this really outspoken politician, potentially even, well, I mean, this is a long shot, but he would make a really cool, maybe unique British prime minister, I would say. Imagine, new king, George Galloway as prime minister. Now, I mean, we're really reaching at the moment, but that would be a really futuristic vision of the future, and a Russian Ukraine as well. So it's just like that would be the complete picture, and a pro-Russian Nathan Rothschild who kind of lays back and doesn't pressure the Orthodox world too much like his ancestors did. I mean, it's just the perfect scenario doesn't exist, unfortunately, but here we are, just kind of planning, and maybe this is a fantasizing and speculation, but we're allowed to do that before Great Lent, because things are going to get really intense very soon.
Very true. Of course, we are preparing for the fast, with dread, some being honest might say, but, with joy as well, begrudgingly. But with all of that, I think this was a very packed episode. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Be sure to get behind the paywall on worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. Still works, of course. Get behind the paywall here. All of our Ether Hour episodes, we talk about history, church issues, all sorts of stuff. We have our recent Q&As where I talk about some of my trip to Russia. I was just there again. We talk about some Central European monarchy stuff, the Nazis on Mount Athos, all sorts of interesting topics. So be sure to get behind the paywall to listen to that. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, WorldWarNow_. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Follow us on Telegram at WorldWarNowTelly. We're growing on there pretty fast. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now, leave a comment, like the videos. That always helps us out. Even if you don't listen to the YouTube video and you're already listening on Substack, go and like the video anyway. Like the videos on Substack as well. Leave comments, like those videos. It really helps us out. More people are able to find the content. And like I mentioned earlier, if you want to make clips and add subtitles, that will really help us out. We'll share it across all the socials and everything. So please do that if you can. We're on Rumble, obviously. World War Now, it's not our biggest platform, but we're trying to have a backup there. And with all of that, again, thank you so much for listening to the show, and we'll see you next week. God bless.